second talk that I'm going to give today really piggybacks off of the first talk about the principles of youth ministry. And remember, we talked about incarnational theology and how we want to become Jesus, so to speak, in the lives of our students. So just to recap a little bit, here's the quote again from Pope Paul VI. "On us particularly rests the responsibility of reshaping with boldness and wisdom the means that are most suitable and effective for communicating the gospel message to the men and women of our times." What we're really going to be talking about is how to effectively facilitate a small group discussion within Youth Alpha. What's God up to? We need to really provide opportunities for people to respond to the gospel message, and that's what we talked about a little bit at the end of last talk. Another example, again, is to pray. Healings is another way. Just praying with your students is a way that they can respond to God. Another example, a little more practical, is to give them a ride home. Give them a ride somewhere else, to a soccer game or to a play like before. And what that does, again, is it shows them that you are not only their youth minister, giving them knowledge about Jesus and the faith, but you're there someone that cares about them. So the quote there at the end, the youth culture, and a youth culture that cries out, "Prove that God exists," and they will say that to you. We need to demonstrate it, that God exists, by our faith, and sharing our faith with them. So we might ask, why should we do small groups? And the first thing we can say is, well, Jesus did small groups. If you think back to the life of Jesus, he started with a core group of disciples. They call it his inner circle. And those disciples are Peter, James, and John. A lot of times Andrew is also thrown in there. So if you think of Jesus, and then there's kind of circles coming out, emulating from Jesus, we have his inner circle, which is Peter, James, and John, sometimes Andrew. And then another circle around that would be the group of 12 disciples that Jesus had around him regularly. And as you can see on the PowerPoint there, that's a pretty decent size to model a small group after 12. Then Jesus had other disciples that followed him around that weren't part of the 12 that we know, but there were other disciples. Lazarus is a good example. He was around Jesus, a disciple of Jesus. And then, so the other disciples are another circle outside of Jesus. And then there's the largest circle, which we would call the crowds and multitudes, that follow Jesus around just to hear his teaching, but they're not necessarily actively invested in becoming a disciple necessarily, but they're just interested in Jesus' teaching. But we can see here that Jesus initiated with people with the use of small groups. Well, what is a small group? We're going to be talking about the size of a small group and the safety of a small group. What small groups do is they give an opportunity for people, students, to voice what they believe. And when I have been in my small group, our Alpha training, our Alpha group, the students are fairly frank with what they believe. Some of them have flat out said, well, I don't believe in God. I don't believe that the Bible is reliable. So it does give that opportunity for them to share those opinions. And as Josh mentioned in his talk earlier, they can ask any question. Anything's open, under the sun. We'll talk about anything. And people have, the most common question is, why is there evil in the world? And thankfully that's one of the Alpha talks. So a lot of their big, kind of difficult questions, we'll say, some of them will be answered through the course of the talks. Others might need to take a little more time in the small groups. The last 3 points here on this slide: discover truths for themselves, teach them how to think, not just what to think, and build relationships. They're really tied together in, again, what we've been trying to say with the incarnational ministry that we as youth leaders are trying to present and live out for the students. So when we say discover truths for themselves and then also teach them how to think, not what to think, the Alpha Talks are going to present material which, they might sleep through it, they might listen, they might sleep through it, they might be somewhat involved in listening to the talk, but they might not be fairly interested in hearing a lecture. They get that at school. They've gotten that all throughout their church experience in Sunday school and religious education. But when in a small group, what we really try to do is have them develop the ability to think for themselves and not just take in what we're giving them. The leadership of a small group, a good idea is to use young people. What that does is it helps the students in the small group relate to that person more easily. If you use an adult, that's not necessarily bad, though the more years you get away from the student's age, the more it feels like it's an authority figure over them. And I mean, this isn't a hard and fast rule. I mean, it depends on people's personalities. Some adults are just more relational with kids. They might relate better to certain people or others. But using young people is a good option. If you are a facilitator in a small group, you want to be just that. You want to be a facilitator, not necessarily a guru who knows all the answers of the faith of Christianity, dealing with Jesus, God, and all that great stuff. While you might have a good system of apologetics that you use for yourself, you don't want to necessarily throw all that out there on the first day of the small group, kind of like what Josh was saying. What we want to do, again, is they've already heard the talk. We don't want to give them just more information. We want to be able to create in them the ability to learn and have their brains be malleable, be chewing on this stuff, so that they start to understand it for themselves, as opposed to us just feeding them the right answers. So just some other practical things here. We want to look for their opinions, like we've mentioned. Their opinion might be that God doesn't exist. And while our presupposition is that God does exist, we need to take that as a valid point and not dismiss it immediately. And hopefully throughout the course, we can work on that student and allow them the opportunity through the talks and through the incarnational ministry that we're doing to help them come along to belief in God. That's just one example. Don't take sides. I can think of in my small group, there's different high schools represented. So sometimes there'll be a little argument from one side to another. You just don't want to get involved with taking one side or the other. Have everyone get along, which would be ideal. You want to briefly summarize, though, the main points of the talk, just to help solidify that in their minds. Preparing the right questions is an art rather than a science. In small groups, I don't know if any of you have, as teenagers, I can think back to my own teenage years. When I came home from school, my mom would say, "Well, how was school?" And I said, "Good." She said, "What did you learn?" I said, "Stuff." So you want to really use open-ended questions as opposed to closed-ended questions. For example, if my mom said, "What did you think about what you learned in history today?" I couldn't really come up with a one-word answer for that. I would have to delve in a little bit more deeply. So what do you feel about this? What do you think about this? Simple versus complicated questions. You want simple questions in the sense, not simple in that they would give you simple answers, but simple in the sense that they can answer your question well, as opposed to a complicated question where they would maybe be a little confused, not answer the question completely. Specific versus vague questions, sort of the same thing. When you're asking them specific things, they need to come up with an answer, as opposed to a vague question. They could be like, I don't know. And you also want to direct your questions back into the group. And that is a really good point, because me as a group leader, I can be talking to one student, and we can be having a really great conversation. But the rest of the group is not really involved in that conversation between me and this one student if it just keeps going back and forth. And I can think of students in my own alpha group where it's easy for me to do that if I wanted to just talk with that one student. Another way to do it would be to come back to me and go to another student, and then I could comment on that, go to another student, I can comment on that. What you really want to do, though, with your small group, and this could be a goal or a measurement to say, all right, we've arrived at a good small group, is when the conversation is bouncing from person to person and not necessarily coming back to the leader or the facilitator. Because at that point, it crosses the bridge between me as a guru, trying to give them the right answers, to, well, these are students, and they're really trying to work this out. This, meaning what was presented, this issue of Christianity, they're really trying to work this out for themselves. So that would be a good goal to have for your small groups. This book by Nikki Gumbel, Searching Issues, is a must-read for anyone on Alpha. And we did